In the 1930s, on Dinu land, a sheep was never only a number on a government form. It could mean wool waiting to be cleaned and spun. It could mean meat for a household, a small income, transport sustained by a larger herd, or the work that held a family of Tams day together. So when federal officials began reducing Navajo livestock, the action was not experienced as a technical adjustment to a range. It reached directly into homes, labor, food, and the material basis of independence. The federal program was called Livestock Reduction. Its stated purpose was soil and range conservation. Government surveys warned that long drought, erosion, and more animals than the range was thought able to carry were damaging grazing land. Those conditions were real. The question is not whether the range faced pressure. It did. The harder question is why the response became a program in which Dino-C families were required to sell or lose animals, and why its effects still shape the way this history is remembered. The National Park Service summarizes the outcome without softening it. During the 1930s and 1940s, a federal soil and range program forced the reduction of flocks on Navajo land, and tens of thousands of sheep were killed. The agency also notes the severe economic impact among pastoral Navajo people. That sentence contains the central fact of this episode, but it does not explain the decisions around it, the choices families lost, or why reducing sheep also touched Navajo weaving and local food systems. This is a public history told through government records, later studies, National Park Service material, and the Navajo Nashinar TM's own discussion of sheep and wool. The sources show two realities at once: environmental strain and a policy whose harm could not be measured only in head counts. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Navajo Nation was changing quickly. The Navajo Reservation had been established by treaty in 1868 after the Long Walk and Bosque Redondo imprisonment. Over subsequent decades, its boundaries expanded, the Dino-C population grew, and livestock numbers grew with it. Sheep, goats, horses, and cattle moved through a landscape where water was uneven. Grasses depended on rain, and drought could turn an ordinary season into a crisis. The phrase overgrazing can sound neutral. On the ground, it meant officials saw bare soil, erosion near water sources, and range areas they believed could no longer support the animals using them. A Smithsonian study of the program recounts federal surveys and range estimates that led officials to argue that animal numbers needed to fall. The Navajo National Boar's TM's own drought planning material acknowledges that rangelands faced pressure, while also stressing that the history of reduction has made later grazing policy deeply complicated. That complication matters. It prevents two easy but false versions of the story. One version says the federal program was merely an attack on Dino-C life and had no environmental reasoning at all. The other says conservation needs made the outcome inevitable and therefore acceptable. The record supports neither simplification. Federal officials had a conservation rationale. Dino-C families endured a program whose implementation could be coercive, uneven, and destructive to household security. For many families, herding was not a separate industry set apart from culture. Sheep provided wool for clothing and weaving, meat for food, and goods for exchange. A recent Navajo Nation account describes sheep as central to Dino-C life and self-reliance, and describes weaving as beginning long before a loom, with shearing, cleaning, spinning, and dyeing wool. That modern statement should not be projected unchanged onto every family in the 1930s, but it helps explain why an animal count could never tell the full story. The federal program began in 1933. It did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived after drought, economic depression, changing reservation boundaries, earlier federal interventions, and a long history in which the United States had already controlled Dino-C movement, land, and livestock. That context did not make every range assessment wrong. It did mean that families had every reason to understand a new directive as more than a scientific recommendation. To see how this became a crisis, we have to look at the machinery of reduction: surveys, quotas, permits, sales, slaughter, and the gap between an official calculation of carrying capacity and a family's calculation of what it needed to live. Federal planners approached the Navajo Range through measurements. They counted animals in units, mapped grazing districts, estimated forage, and tried to match the number of animals in each district to what officials called the land attempts carrying capacity. In that administrative language, a flock became a figure to be adjusted. The problem was that families did not live in administrative language. They lived with animals whose uses were different and whose loss could not be replaced by a single cash payment. The Navajo National Temis drought plan history describes a changing system in which herds moved seasonally and were attended daily. It also says federal agents regarded the range as overstocked and later divided the reservation into grazing districts. By 1940, according to that account, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was issuing grazing permits based on the 1937 livestock count. Those permits eventually restricted movement across new district boundaries. The change did not only reduce herd numbers, it reshaped decisions about where and how livestock could move in response to dry conditions. That is the first major point that gets lost in short retellings. Livestock reduction was not only a moment of slaughter, it was also a new system of management. Federal agencies substituted maps, permits, and numerical ceilings for patterns of household movement that had developed over generations. A permit could be presented as a conservation tool. To a family, it could also be a boundary imposed on its ability to adapt when water or grass failed. The early program included sales and compensation. On paper, that may look less violent than a forced taking. But compensation only answers one question: what amount of money was paid for an animal? It does not answer whether the money could replace milk, meat, wool, transport, breeding stock, or a household of Thames margin of safety. A scholarly article preserved through the Navajo Nation describes how smaller herders could be especially vulnerable, because goats supplied milk and meat while larger commercial herds had different resources. The same article records that some people were promised jobs, more land, or irrigation projects that did not materialize at the scale hoped for. The history also changed from persuasion to pressure. A Smithsonian account says that officials initially emphasized reduction and improvement, but shifted toward a forced program when voluntary cooperation weakened. The word forsta should be used precisely. It does not mean every family experienced the same official action in the same way. It means the policy could move beyond voluntary sale, with government authority deciding the reduction that households had to accept. The visible methods were painful. Animals were bought, driven away, and in many cases killed. National Park Service material records tens of thousands of sheep killed during the 1930s and 1940s. Navajo Nation reporting likewise describes the sale and slaughter of tens of thousands of sheep, goats, cattle, and horses. These are not details to turn into spectacle. They matter because they show why an environmental program became a personal trauma in many communities. The scale was large enough to transform the social economy of the nation. One Smithsonian historical study, drawing on earlier research, reports a decline from roughly 1 million mature sheep units in 1933 to about 720,000 by 1937 across the Navajo Agency area. This number is useful only if we read its limit. A mature sheep unit is an administrative measure of forage demand. It is not a count of identical animals, and it does not measure a household TM's, food, labor, or identity. The statistical decrease tells us scale. It does not tell us what a family lost. Why did officials pursue the program so aggressively? The federal view was that severe erosion and damaged grasslands threatened the future of the reservation itself. Dust Bowl conditions elsewhere in the region made conservation politically urgent. Some federal planners believed reducing stock would protect land and make future herding possible. That intention is documented, but intention does not erase the program as some design flaws, its disregard for local consequences, or the unequal burden placed on those with the least reserve. The policy therefore created a contradiction. It claimed to protect the basis of Dino C pastoral life while removing animals that made pastoral life possible. It tried to address a long-term environmental danger by making short-term household survival more difficult. It introduced a management framework meant to restore land, yet its memory made later conservation policy harder to trust. The next part of the record brings that contradiction into sharper focus. Sheep were connected not only to grazing and income, but also to the wool that moved through Womenutiem's work, family knowledge, and Navajo weaving. To understand why sheep reduction reached beyond the pasture, begin with wool. A Navajo textile does not begin at a loom. It begins with an animal, a season, shearing, washing, sorting, carding, spinning, and dyeing. The finished rug is visible in museums and markets. The labor that made its yarn possible is often less visible. When a flock was reduced, the loss could travel through every stage before weaving even began. The Navajo Nashonatem's recent account of sheep and weaving puts this plainly. Sheep supplied meat, clothing material, and a basis for trade. Each rug began with work on wool before a loom was used. That account is contemporary, but it describes a relationship with animals and fiber that helps make historical reduction legible. The policy did not just remove property from an abstract economy. It disrupted resources connected to food, household work, and skilled production. That does not mean every Dino-C weaver used the same wool, sold through the same market, or faced the same loss. Some families had different kinds of herds. Traders and markets shaped textile production in changing ways. Manufactured yarn was available to some weavers. A careful history cannot turn a diverse community into one household story. Still, the connection between sheep and wool gives the reduction program an importance that cannot be captured by a chart of range capacity. The Navajo Churro breed makes the connection especially clear. National Park Service material describes its long, coarse wool with an outer coat and softer inner coat, as well as its varied colors. After the reduction period, the Park Service says fewer than 450 Navajo Churro sheep remained on Navajo land by the 1970s. Later restoration efforts sought to preserve the breed and help revitalize weaving traditions. This was not a return to an untouched past. It was a deliberate effort to recover a material resource that had been brought close to disappearance. The story of the breed should not be used to claim that every sheep killed in the 1930s was a Navajo Churro, or that one program alone explains all later changes in weaving. Livestock history is more complicated than that. Breeds changed, markets changed, and families adapted in many ways. What the evidence supports is narrower and stronger. Forced reduction drastically reduced flocks. The Navajo Churro population later became dangerously small, and people worked to restore it because the animals mattered to wool, weaving, and heritage. The effect of reduction was also uneven across wealth. A large herd could represent assets. A small herd could represent survival. The article preserved by the Navajo Nation notes that goats were especially important to households relying on milk and meat, and that small herders could be reduced below subsistence. This is another reason a uniform percentage target could have unequal results. Losing 10 animals from a large flock is not the same as losing 10 animals from a family with few alternatives. Gender is part of this history, but it needs careful language. We should not invent a single woman or Thames reaction, or assume every household divided work in the same way. What can be said is that wool processing and weaving involved extensive skilled work, and that a reduction in available fiber could alter the material conditions for that work. A policy announced through Agricultural Administration therefore had consequences in spaces federal reports were poorly equipped to describe. There was also a problem of translation between systems of value. Federal livestock units measured grazing demand. Dino-C households measured animals through their uses, their care, and their place in a web of family labor. Neither vocabulary is imaginary, but only one had the power of federal enforcement behind it. When those systems met in the 1930s, the official unit became the one that set the limit. That imbalance helps explain why the legacy lasts. Later generations did not inherit only a memory of fewer animals. They inherited permits, changed grazing patterns, and skepticism toward programs that promised to improve the land while taking away the means to live on it. The Navajo National Tumaz Drought Plan explicitly says the troubled history of reduction complicates later management and drought responses. That is not resistance to conservation itself. It is a demand that conservation account for history, local knowledge, and family survival. In the present, sheep remain part of Dino-Sea life, but the conditions are different. Wool markets fluctuate. Drought and water infrastructure create new pressures. Navajo producers and institutions continue to work on grazing, wool, and herd management. The next question is how a history of federal coercion can inform a future in which range care is still necessary. The easiest ending to this story would say that the government reduced sheep, the damage was done, and the past is over. The contemporary record says otherwise. The environmental problems that officials identified in the 1930s did not disappear. Drought, water scarcity, forage limits, and livestock pressure remain practical concerns on the Navajo Nation. The difference is that present-day decisions are made within a sovereign nation whose agencies, ranchers, and communities bring the history of reduction into the conversation. The Navajo Nation Department of Agriculture describes agriculture and livestock as central to Navajo society, economy, and sovereign development. Its current livestock management programs address drought and carrying capacity, while its public material also recognizes the role of range restoration, water collection, and soil conservation. This is important because it prevents a false choice. Respecting Dino-Sea families does not require pretending that land and water have no limits. Good stewardship must be possible without recreating the coercion of the 1930s. It also matters that wool remains an economic question. In 2024 and 2025, Navajo Nation offices described wool and mohair buying events intended to support producers after market difficulties. The reports describe producers bringing wool to be sorted and weighed, and they connect the effort to a longer history of sheep, weaving, and self-reliance. These events do not undo livestock reduction. They show that the relationship between animals, wool, and household economy is still active rather than merely historical. The Navajo Churro restoration story belongs here as well. By the mid-1970s, people began preserving and rebuilding flocks of a breed that the National Park Service says had dwindled to fewer than 450 animals on Navajo land. The goal was not simply to preserve a rare animal for display. It was linked to fiber, weaving, food, and the continuity of knowledge connected with raising sheep. Restoration was an answer to loss, but it was also an act of choice about the future. This does not mean the past yields a simple policy lesson. Today, TM's drought, climate conditions, markets, and infrastructure differ from those of the 1930s. No historical documentary can calculate the correct number of animals for a particular range today. That is the work of producers, communities, agricultural specialists, and Navajo institutions. What history can do is make one standard unavoidable. Decisions about land must not erase the people whose lives depend on that land. The federal program's greatest failure was not that officials noticed erosion. It was the belief that a land problem could be solved by treating households as variables in someone else's calculation. Maps and surveys were necessary tools, but they were not enough. They could estimate grass. They could not fully measure how a goat supplied milk, how wool entered a household economy, how a herd protected a family in hard times, or how a forced sale would be remembered decades later. The policy also reveals a broader truth about public records. A report may be exact about acreage, animal units, and permit boundaries, while remaining incomplete about human consequence. That does not make the report useless. It tells us how to read it. Pair a range survey with a history of weaving. Pair a permit rule with the family resources it limited. Pair a conservation claim with a testimony and institutional memory that explain its cost. There is a reason the word "o" or reduction "o" remains so charged. It sounds like a neutral administrative term. In the documented history of the Navajo Nation, it meant animals removed, income cut, food systems strained, wool supplies altered, and confidence in federal management damaged. That meaning survives not because Dinoc people rejected care for the land, but because the policy joined environmental concern to unequal power. At this point, the original question has a clearer answer. The United States required Navajo families to reduce livestock because federal officials believed grazing pressure and erosion threatened the range. But the program was not just conservation. Its coercive methods and narrow measures imposed profound losses on families whose animals were central to daily life and economic resilience. The final step is to be exact about what that answer proves and what it cannot. It proves the program was real, severe, and consequential. It does not give us permission to invent a universal experience for every Dino-C family. The surviving record is strongest when it shows both the scale of the policy and the limits of its own numbers. The federal government began the program in 1933 because officials believed the Navajo Range was carrying more livestock than drought-strained land could sustain. Surveys documented erosion and depleted forage. Those concerns were not invented. Any honest account must begin there. But the same evidence also shows why the program became one of the most painful chapters in modern Dino-C history. It moved from management advice toward coercive reduction. It required families to give up animals through sales, removal, and slaughter. It counted stock in standardized units while overlooking the different roles sheep, goats, horses, and cattle played in households. And it left a legacy that Navajo institutions still describe as complicating grazing policy and drought response. The outcome was severe. The National Park Service documents large-scale killing of sheep across the 1930s and 1940s. The Navajo Churro breed later came close to disappearing on Navajo land. Federal permits altered mobility and grazing patterns. Families lost resources that had provided food, wool, income, and independence. The strongest conclusion, then, is not that environmental concerns were a disguise or that all conservation is hostile to Dino-C life. The stronger conclusion is that conservation can fail when it is imposed without sufficient regard for sovereignty, local systems of care, unequal household resources, or the meanings of the things it asks people to surrender. That conclusion matters beyond this one episode. It changes how we view a Navajo rug, a flock crossing open land, or a modern wool-buy event. None of those things are merely remnants of an old rural economy. They are part of a living relationship among animals, work, family, land, and choice. The policy of the 1930s damaged that relationship, but it did not end it. The present-day Navajo Nation TM's agricultural work makes the continuity visible. Ranchers still face drought. Communities still need water systems, healthy range, viable markets, and reliable food. Sheep and wool still matter. The difference is that the future is not an empty range waiting for outside planners to measure it. It is a place where Dino-C people continue to decide how to sustain a way of life under changing conditions. There is a visual image that holds this history without turning it into spectacle. A shearing table, a sack of wool, a spinning tool, and an open stretch of dry range beyond a fence. Each object points to a different part of the story. The wool points to skilled labor. The range points to genuine environmental limits. The fence points to regulation and boundary. None of them alone explains what happened. Together, they show why the policy could never be only about sheep. If the first question was why the United States ordered Dino-C families to reduce their herds, the answer is now clear. Federal officials sought to address erosion and range conditions. The means they chose imposed a disproportionate human cost because they treated livestock as numbers before they understood them as the foundation of many households. The records can show us dates, rules, and totals. They cannot calculate the value of every animal lost or speak for every family. That limit is not a reason to turn history into mystery. It is a reason to listen closely to the evidence we do have, including the Navajo Nation TM's continuing insistence that sheep, wool, land, and family livelihood belong in the same conversation. That is the legacy of livestock reduction. Not a secret buried in the past, but a documented warning about what happens when a policy designed for land refuses to see the people living with it.